Hello everyone, and welcome to Influencing the Future of Healthcare by Synthesizing Qualitative Research. This was a presentation that I worked on with my supervisor, Dr. Karen McKinnon, and I presented it at the annual Qualitative Health Research Conference in Victoria, BC on October 21st to 23rd, 2014. And I thought I would just redo it to post it here to allow more people to have access to it. As a graduate student, I have begun to delve into the vast area of research synthesis, and these signposts relate to my feelings of unsettledness about qualitative synthesis, which have created numerous questions. So I am speaking to you today from the perspective of a student in order to introduce some key aspects to consider when thinking about doing a qualitative systematic review. We hope that you find this presentation helpful and informative, and that it will continue to stimulate further discussion about qualitative synthesis. So my plan for the next 20 minutes or so is to provide a general overview on the following points, and I will begin with presenting some definitions of synthesis and its significance for knowledge development, as well as explore some of the tensions, speak to some approaches, as well as discuss processes surrounding searching and appraising reports, synthesizing findings, and writing the report. I will also introduce the Joanna Briggs Institute's method of meta-aggregation as one example of a way to synthesize research. So what is meant by qualitative synthesis? We have pulled out some definitions in order to understand how synthesis might be conceptualized. For example, Hans and Lockwood suggest that it involves the creation of new understanding through interpretation. Sandalowski and Barroso suggest that it involves formal, systematic processes for integrating findings. These authors suggest two broad categories of synthesis, where a qualitative meta-summary is a quantitative aggregation of primary studies. Validation in this sense relates to frequency and replication of findings. Qualitative meta-synthesis is an interpretive process using findings from primary research reports that are also interpretive, for example, conceptual thematic descriptions or interpretive explanations. Here, new interpretations are generated as part of the synthesis to present a cohesive understanding of a phenomenon beyond a summary of unlinked findings. Saini and Shlonsky suggest that synthesis methods exist on a continuum, from aggregative to interpretive approaches. Aggregative approaches are said to be those which involve the pooling of frequencies of themes, such as in a meta-summary, and interpretive approaches can generate new theories and construct new interpretations and understandings. Our final definition is from the Joanna Briggs Institute, in which their meta-aggregative approach to synthesis includes pooling of findings from qualitative studies. So although this is a mere sampling of how synthesis is defined and understood, it provides a good place to begin to understand areas of potential similarity as well as contention. So why might one want to pursue synthesizing qualitative evidence? There began to be a proliferation of qualitative research performed in the 80s, and later concerns voiced about this research being underutilized for informing practice. Sandalowski and colleagues cautioned that methods needed to be developed which would aid in looking at relationships among qualitative studies in order to avoid researchers' continual reinventing of the wheel through production of separate works on similar topics. Evidence-based practice initiatives have also increased the need for empirical evidence for policy and practice, which has stimulated challenges towards what actually constitutes evidence and how knowledge has been hierarchically arranged. Hopp and Rittenmeyer explain how evidence comes from research, professional nursing expertise, and patient preference, and qualitative research can inform all of these domains. Further, qualitative synthesis can help to explore differences and similarities in contexts and researcher perspectives, identify gaps and ambiguities in research, and help to revise or refute current understandings of phenomena. So there is a notion of fluidity inherent in qualitative synthesis, as Sandalowski and Barroso see evidence not as a stable commodity, but as an evolving entity. However, there are also concerns surrounding how aspects of fluidity, standardization, protocol, and other processes can be balanced for synthesizing qualitative research. This tension, however, is not necessarily a bad thing, but can rather raise our awareness about certain aspects of our experience. For example, appropriate amounts of tension can be a good thing, for instance with respect to bridges, violin strings and bows, and playing drums. As an aside, this is Neil Peart, one of the top rock genre drummers from the Canadian band Rush, and he is looking a little intense. So I see it as important to balance the tensions within and among synthesis approaches, which can assist in figuring out how best to proceed with synthesizing studies on a particular topic. So what are some of the tensions? For clarity, we have divided them into philosophical and methodological tensions. Some suggest that synthesis can enhance the value of qualitative research, bringing it into the mainstream for contributing to the evidence landscape. As well, synthesis has the potential to increase utilization value and power of qualitative studies through development of cross-case generalizations. However, there are also suggestions that the mere thought of synthesizing qualitative research violates underlying goals and assumptions, and that attempts to synthesize it is only a way to make qualitative research conform to ideas about what constitutes valid science. Underlying these tensions are related philosophical differences, where the realist stance of evidence-based practice, including beliefs about standardization, generalization, and adherence to formal procedure, perhaps conflicts with the relativist postmodern stance, which can characterize qualitative inquiry. Here, traditional notions of generalizability are questionable, and difference, variation, and contradictions may be embraced. Other authors, including Hans and Lockwood, suggest that qualitative synthesis methods are characterized along a continuum of realism and idealism, where assumptions relate to whether synthesis represents an external reality or whether the synthesis consists of constructions of knowledge. Important to consider also are philosophical orientations of those engaged in the synthesis process. The inherent plurality of perspectives that characterizes qualitative research leads to questions regarding how to synthesize, or if one should even do a synthesis, of disparate methods. Reading the literature, there is no consensus on various facets, including terminology, whether one should match synthesis methods with those in primary studies, if sampling of the literature should be comprehensive or purposive, what the goals of the synthesis might be: aggregation, integration, interpretation, comparison, critique, as well as differing discussions on what constitutes an actual qualitative synthesis. For example, Zimmer argues for a Gadamerian lens where the synthesis process is dialogically examining part and whole through analysis of the multiple secondary interpretations offered by the researchers of the original studies. In addition, qualitative research is reported in numerous ways, from experimental style formats to artistic presentations such as poems and plays, which adds to further questions about if or how these reports can be synthesized. Some authors offer what I see to be a slightly different way to conceptualize philosophical and methodological perspectives together, as dimensions existing along a continuum. That is, relationships between ideas about knowledge exist relationally with whether the goals of the synthesis are more related to theory development or perhaps to informing policy and practice. How one sees the prominence of aggregation or pooling of findings, or more interpretive stances, also exists along a continuum. And the degree of iteration through the systematic review process could also vary, with a more predefined, unaltered research question tended to be closer to an aggregative type approach, whereas significant iteration and refinement of the research question occurs in more interpretive approaches. I found Barnett, Page, and Thomas's work on critically reviewing qualitative synthesis methods helpful. in that they argue that the various methods reflect differences in epistemologies or understandings around knowledge, which explains why there are a multitude of methods for synthesis. For example, they suggest a spectrum, similar to the continuum of subjective idealism, objective idealism, critical realism, scientific realism, naive realism, which is underpinned by highly constructivist notions of knowledge and reality, right through to understandings of a direct view of the world. And it is these epistemological beliefs which will impact which systematic review method may be chosen. So, what are some of the types of qualitative synthesis? Santalowski and Barroso suggest two overarching perspectives that I mentioned earlier, and differing philosophical perspectives are reflected, for example, in the understanding of language of the two approaches. There are also some others which I will mention here, such as realist synthesis, critical interpretive synthesis, and Bayesian approaches. Very generally, a realist synthesis considers how context and human agency intersect to influence certain interventions. That is, how people choose whether or not to use a particular intervention. A critical interpretive synthesis can bring together quantitative and qualitative research in order to integrate effectiveness studies, what works, with research and theoretical papers about what might be relevant in various contexts. Bayesian approaches, using certain assumptions about probability, provide novel ways for mixed methods research by providing ways of quantitizing qualitative evidence or qualitizing quantitative evidence in order to combine findings from a vast array of research literature. So, using the JBI approach as an example, we thought it would be helpful to outline the steps for undertaking a JBI systematic review. A preliminary literature review is first done to gain an idea of what literature, if any, currently exists on your topic. As well, it is helpful to begin thinking about resources you might have available in terms of who might be on your team, librarian assistance, as well as other considerations such as time and budget concerns. A clear research question is developed with consideration to the current literature and stakeholder needs, and JBI provides a template for the question in which you must outline inclusion criteria, your population, the phenomenon of interest, and the context. JBI also provides a template for the entire protocol in which details of the proposed systematic review are outlined in much more detail. Once the title and the protocol have been registered by JBI, your systematic review can begin. A primary and secondary reviewer screen the literature, beginning with the abstracts, gather those which meet the inclusion criteria, critically appraise them using a template from JBI, and then extract, categorize, and synthesize the findings of the included studies. JBI provides a template for the extraction process as well, and a third reviewer acts as a tiebreaker when there are conflicts about any particular study. JBI utilizes the PRISMA guidelines for reporting, and when the systematic review is completed, it is published with JBI. A JBI systematic review must be systematic, transparent, and comprehensive in its search strategy. Therefore, it is extremely helpful to consult with a research librarian who can help you in not only choosing relevant databases, but also to develop search strategies designed for each database to aid in successful retrieval of the literature. JBI's approach is to attempt to gather all of the relevant literature on a topic, and also to have a clear search strategy that others could also replicate. Of course, there are challenges to searching for qualitative research due to the variety in ways in which authors have titled their works, but also how various databases have labeled qualitative literature. These can complicate the processes of locating qualitative studies. The next step is to consider appraising the literature, which is another area of tension in qualitative synthesis discussions. The JBI approach, for example, utilizes standardized appraisal tools for interpretive and critical literature. And also they have various appraisal tools for expert opinion and text. However, it is also recognized that due to publication limitations, aspects of a study may not be addressed within a publication. So questions arise as to whether an evaluation of quality is more about the reporting of the research instead of elements of the actual research that is conducted and analyzed. There are dangers that relevant studies could be erroneously excluded when rigid appraisal criteria are applied. Saini and Schlonsky suggest that underlying philosophical beliefs impact orientations towards appraisal, in that post-positivist assumptions promote using standardized criteria, focusing on generalizability and minimizing bias, whereas interpretive assumptions see knowledge as contextual and created, which precludes the development of standardized approaches to appraisal. Saini and Schlonsky opt for a pragmatic position to appraisal and suggest guideposts in which the interpretation of quality relates to the underlying methodology of primary studies. Here, the authors argue, quote, "The story matters, not the discrete ratings of quality," unquote. They also suggest that appraisal be done in a dynamic way instead of being rigidly or prescriptively applied. Qualitative presentations that do not tend to follow typical research report design, such as poems, plays, and other artistic presentations, cannot often be synthesized as they do not have recognizable findings. In their article, Finding the Findings in Qualitative Studies, Sandalowski and Barroso discuss the challenges related to locating findings in qualitative studies. These authors note how philosophical understandings can affect the identification and separation of findings in studies. For example, one could see data as empirical material from which findings evolve, or that data and findings are co-constructed interpretations and therefore inseparable. Related to these understandings are notions of whether data are collected or generated. And adding to the confusion are how data are sometimes presented as findings, how reasoning behind identification of patterns or themes is unclear, or how data are under or over interpreted. Significant to me is how Sandalowski and Barroso point out that many of these issues are often found in theses and dissertations, which gives me much to think about as I conduct my own dissertation work. However, Sandalowski and Barroso do insist that, and I will quote them here, is that for qualitative findings to matter in research integration work, in the development and implementation of policy, and in clinical practice, they have to be found. The JBI aggregative approach is a three-step process, which begins with extracting findings into the software program and assigning a level of credibility to each finding. An unequivocal finding is accompanied by an illustration that is beyond reasonable doubt in supporting the finding, thus is not open to challenge. A credible finding is linked with an illustration lacking clear association with it and is therefore open to challenge. An unsupported finding is not supported by data at all. Once findings have been extracted, similar findings are grouped into a larger category, and then categories are synthesized once again. JBI then provides software assistance for assembling the written systematic review report, which should include background, objectives, search strategies, including the PRISMA flowchart, and discussions about methodological quality of studies, data collection and synthesis, results, conclusions, and also needs to include implications for practice with grades of recommendation and suggestions for further research. JBI's approach to synthesis focuses on generating generalizable statements in the form of recommendations to guide practitioners and policymakers. Saini and Schlonsky, as well as Sandalowski and Barroso, suggest using various representations of results such as tables, matrices, Venn diagrams, concept maps, and other visual media that can outline complex relationships, condense large volumes of information, or organize information to enhance understanding. Having a transparent review process ensures that others can assess the review's quality and rigor and explore transferability of the knowledge produced. In summary, there are many possible choices for how to navigate through the systematic review landscape. Consideration to various aspects, such as one's belief about knowledge and reality, will perhaps influence how to approach synthesis. As seen in this presentation, there can be ranges in how iterative the review process may be, and related to this is how aggregative and/or interpretive processes are enacted within the review. As well, consideration needs to be given to what research and literature currently exists on your topic, as well as what other resources you may have to assist you. As a student, I think the original developers of Minecraft, the ever-popular online video game, have a vision that might be helpful in how I view research synthesis. That is, it is the engaged creativity of the community of players which will continuously improve the game. And I think it will be the continuous engagement and conversations of those involved in synthesis activities who will maintain a community of synthesis practice within which we can all learn. This concludes my presentation, and thank you. Thanks again for listening, and I've just got 2 slides here full of my references, which are excellent resources for any of you who might be looking to read much more on qualitative synthesis.